I still like writing letters. It's an old-fashioned thing, and not sometimes, it's easier to send a text or an email, but there is something about writing a letter. I wonder if you've ever written a letter to yourself. When I was a teenager, this was a really big thing at every youth retreat and mission trip I would go on. They'd be like, now take some time to write a letter to yourself and we'll mail it to you in a year. I got back about half of those, depending on how responsible the youth leader was that decided to commit to mailing them a year later. There's this idea that we have something to say to ourselves, wisdom that we have within us that we can say to ourselves, but it was always write it to your future self, something down the road. But I wonder if there isn't something within us that we might have to say to ourselves in the present moment. That's what I want for us today. It will be our prayer station. I'm kind of jumping to the end. Our prayer station today is to write a letter to yourself, and not a grocery list. I know sometimes y'all make your grocery lists when you're in church. I know, it's okay. But today, I want you to write a different kind of letter to yourself. Not a text that says, remember to walk the dog, but a letter that addresses you with all of the love you can muster for yourself. Dear beloved, dear wonderful one, dear kind one, to write it from the depths of who you are. And as you're writing that letter, to ask the wisdom that lives within you to speak into your life and our shared life right at this moment. You might not get it done within church today, but I hope that you will take time to write that letter. Now, maybe you're thinking, what would be the point of that? I make my own decisions all the time. Why would I bother asking myself for wisdom? Isn't that how I make every decision? Isn't it better to ask others and hear what they think? And I would agree, it is good to invite the wisdom of others to a point. Wisdom is found in others always, of course, but mostly we hear wisdom from other people because we listen to them more than we listen to ourselves. It's kind of like when I tell my kids they have a difficult situation and I, as their mom, tell them how they should handle it, and they roll their eyes and sigh. I'm like, that's ridiculous, Mom. That would never work. And then someone else offers them similar advice and they're like, oh my gosh, you won't believe what they just told me. It was so intelligent, so wise. I'm not bitter at all that happens. But it's kind of like that. We listen to others. We don't listen to the voices that are closest to us, including the voice that comes from within us. So we have this text today, which seems to say that humans are kind of hopeless, that we have no wisdom at all, that us humans have no idea what we are doing. Paul compares human wisdom to God's wisdom, which of course is always going to fail. But somehow, the reason, thank you, Erica, we read the whole chapter is because Paul makes this amazing movement. It's like poetry as he moves through this passage in a way that unravels all of our initial assumptions. So Paul starts by saying, "For I have decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Other translations have him saying, "I am forgetting everything but Jesus Christ." Can you imagine not knowing anything else but Jesus Christ crucified? I started to wonder about that. What if the only things we knew were things we heard from Scripture or the things we heard in church? How would that change our perspective? How would it change our priorities or our expectations? How would it change us, and how might it change how we engage our world? We once had a church member who worked in sales, and he was advised by his boss not to watch the news regularly, not to read the news regularly, but in order to preserve his lighthearted, charismatic personality, to be a good salesperson, to not get bogged down by all of the news of the world. And one day in a sermon, I shared that historically, most people, back when most people were not able to read and were illiterate, folks got their news from church because the preacher was one of, if not the only person who could read within the community. And so this church member approached me after worship and said, since he didn't follow the news as his boss had advised, that was true for him, that he only heard about the world news in church on Sundays. The things that seemed significant enough that were brought up in prayer or in the sermon, those were the things that he knew about, and then he would research and learn more about them. It was interesting to think about the ways in which there's so much that feels like it overwhelms us. What if we just remembered Jesus Christ? Paul goes on to say that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God. That's what he's hoping for. He is setting up this dichotomy between human wisdom and God's wisdom, which still feels odd. I think when we think of the word wisdom, we usually think of wisdom as good. When we recognize wisdom, we honor it wherever it comes from the mouth of a child or a spiritual leader or an elderly person or someone who isn't a spiritual leader at all. Wherever, when we hear wisdom, we recognize that as good. But what Paul is getting at is the difference between what the world knows versus what God knows. And the ways in which we have values that we rely upon in these different ways. You don't have to scroll very far if you read your news on your phone, and you don't really even have to turn a single page in a newspaper to find out what it seems like our world feeds on. Scandal, greed, power, fear, violence, threat. And on a good day, it's shame wrapped in perfectionism or consumerism. And we know these are not the things of God, which somehow human wisdom still is trying to sell us the things of God, all wrapped in these ways. But the wisdom of God, of course, can't be sold. It's always free. Hope, joy, love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. So what if we were able to really pull these two kinds of wisdoms apart? If we forgot everything but Jesus, everything but love and peace, hope and joy. Now, the way Paul introduces it, it sounds like we don't really have a chance at wisdom when he puts human wisdom, which is what we have, against God's, but he begins to backtrack or maybe go deeper or sidestep himself. He says, yet among the mature, we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to perish. So maybe we can speak wisdom, but just not of this age, which kind of sounds like, oh yeah, anything that's just not trendy or not going viral, that's where the real wisdom is. Maybe we just need to have nostalgia, but we know how much trouble nostalgia can get us into when we say, oh, things were better a few years ago, when we don't look at the full picture of what that means. I think the distinction Paul is making here is between what is and what isn't doomed to perish, as he says. I want you to think of something in your past, a church service that you still can remember with some clarity, or a holiday, a meal, a family gathering, some kind of vacation. Try, if you can, to remember. Go back to that thing and think a little bit ahead. What felt really important as you were preparing for that event? Was it getting the food on the table while it was still hot, or the perfect Christmas gift, not showing up late, having a clean house, making sure everyone looked the part right? And then try to think about why that's the event you're remembering. What mattered about that thing? Compare that to the feeling of the other. Because we know that the things that perish, right? No one remembers what their Christmas gifts were. No one remembers if the food was hot or if the house was clean or if everyone looked the part. But we do remember something deeper. We remember the feelings of love or gratitude or humility or joy. We remember that which is eternal, which we know somewhere deep within. When we heard Paul quotes from Isaiah, and he says, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. Paul is inviting us to imagination. We know We know something, but it is still beyond our imagining who and how God's love and goodness looks in this world. And Paul continues, these things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. That line got to me as it did for Jackie. The depths of God. We cannot conceive, but we can imagine and wonder. What is the depth of God? How is the depth of God? Is there an end to the depth of God? It is the Spirit that searches. But then Paul says in a rather shocking turn of events, and I know shocking is only true for people like me that are like, oh my gosh, did he really just say that? But Paul says, now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit that is from God, so that we may understand the gifts bestowed on us by God. So do you hear what he just said? The Spirit that searches the depth of God, we have received. Me and you and your neighbors and that really frustrating neighbor and your really annoying relative. We have received the depth of God, the same Spirit that reached the depth of God. And we, Paul says, speak of things in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit. Those that are spiritual, Paul says, discern all things. And then the grand finale, which is why we had to have the full 16 verses. But we have the mind of God. But we have the mind of God. What if we forgot everything but what we know in the depths of God, we have the mind of Christ, Paul is leading us to these questions. These questions can lead us to our own depth. What is the depth of God? How does the Spirit that seeks the depth of God exist within us? What does it mean to spiritually discern? If humans so often get it wrong, how could it be that we have the mind of Christ? There's so many good questions here. No answers, really, but so many good questions. Now, spoiler alert, I'm not going to answer any of these questions for you today. But I know who can. And that is you. And that is us. I was at a memorial service for one of my mentors, and the preacher offered this quote. It might have been attributed to someone. I've never found it, but it took up residence within me. She said, we can only ever hear what we in some way already know. We can only ever hear what we in some way already know. It's a strange idea because it implies in some ways that we can't learn new things, which we know isn't true. I learn new things all the time, and so do you. It's why we read books as a church, and the anti-racism team, and Green Justice team, and our DIG group. It's why we're having a wastewater event today to learn more about how our earth works and how we can care for it. It's why we have a sermon every Sunday to learn a little bit more, but maybe the quote isn't really about what we can learn, but what precedes it. That the Spirit of God is within us already. That within each of us is the Spirit that has searched in and through the depth of God. The wisdom of God lives in each of us. And to be spiritual, to spiritually discern, is to listen to that wisdom, to wonder about it, and to trust that God's wisdom is there within us all. I skipped over the verse earlier where it says God's wisdom is secret and hidden. But that is true in the world. We know what is lying beneath the snow and beneath the ground is just waiting for spring to happen. So too, the wisdom of God is within us, waiting for us to drop our bucket into the depths of the well, to draw out all that is already there. So again, our prayer station for today, I'm going to ask you to really hold silence. Silence is one of those ways we drop that bucket into the well, to listen and create sacred space. We'll have music, but to hold silence throughout the sanctuary and to take some moments to write a letter to yourself from that voice that lives within you. Imagine the well of God's wisdom. What does she want to say to you? The Hebrew word for spirit is Sophia. So I call her that. I sign these letters I might write to myself from Sophia. You might call her by that name or another name or no name at all. But however the Spirit speaks to you, let the Spirit speak a word. What would the Spirit say? Because I believe the Spirit has something to say from and to each of us, and from and to us together as a church, if only we would listen. Because the Spirit's wisdom is here within us, and the Spirit's wisdom is abundantly here as us as a church. Can you hear that? For we can only hear what we in some way already know. And I think we know. Amen.